Okay, so let's dive into this chilling masterpiece. Today we're taking a look at Stephen King's The Shining, and we're here to help you figure out if it deserves a spot on your reading list.
It absolutely does. 5 out of 5 stars from me.
Wow, starting strong. But we're not just taking your word for it. We're going to break down why The Shining is considered such a horror classic
Yeah.
and whether it lives up to the hype, especially for those of us who might be familiar with the movie but haven't experienced the book itself.
Yes, and I actually haven't seen the film, so we're going in purely based on King's words.
Interesting. All right, so for those unfamiliar, what's the basic premise of The Shining?
It's about a family, Jack, Wendy, and their son, Danny, who become winter caretakers of a remote hotel in the Colorado mountains called the Overlook. Sounds idyllic, right? Except this hotel has a sinister history, and it's got its sights set on the Torrances.
So we've got a haunted hotel, a family in isolation. Already sounds like a recipe for some serious chills. But what makes The Shining stand out from other horror novels? What grabbed you?
King's ability to create a truly unsettling atmosphere. It's not just about jump scares or gore. He builds this sense of creeping dread that seeps into your bones.
Okay, I can see how that would be effective, but how does he actually do that? What's an example?
Take the way he uses snow. It's not just a pretty backdrop. It becomes this oppressive force that isolates the family, traps them both physically and psychologically. There's this scene where Jack is watching Danny play, and the way King describes the snowdrifts towering over them, it's like they're being swallowed by this vast, unforgiving landscape. It perfectly mirrors that feeling of being trapped and overwhelmed by the situation.
I get that. I think anyone who's experienced a harsh winter can relate to that feeling of being stuck,
Yeah,
the world closing in on you.
exactly. And King uses those everyday experiences, those relatable fears, to amplify the horror. He makes you feel the cold, the isolation, the sense of unease that something's not quite right.
So it's not just about the supernatural elements. It's about tapping into those very real human anxieties. That's
Well,
interesting.
Absolutely. And it's why The Shining is so effective. It gets under your skin and stays with you long after you finish reading.
Now, I've heard some people say that King's writing can be a bit too detailed, even repetitive at times. Did you find that with The Shining?
Honestly, I didn't. Yes, he takes his time setting the stage, but I think it's necessary. He needs to build that foundation of dread, get deep into the characters' heads to make the horror truly impactful. He's creating a world, not just telling a story.
So those details, that
Uh-huh.
slow burn, it's
Yeah.
all part of the experience.
Exactly. And I think anyone who appreciates good writing, who enjoys getting lost in a well-crafted world,
Yeah.
will appreciate King's approach here.
Now let's talk about these characters. Jack Torrance, he's kind of infamous, right?
Mm.
But you're saying he's more than just straightforward villain.
Oh, absolutely. He's battling alcoholism, struggling with anger issues. And you see how these internal demons make him vulnerable to the Overlook's influence. King doesn't shy away from showing Jack's flaws.
Okay, so we're not getting a one-dimensional bad guy. There's some nuance there.
Definitely. He loves his family. He wants to be better. But the darkness inside him, the potential for violence, it's always simmering beneath the surface. And what's fascinating is that King wrote this book while battling his own alcoholism. You can almost feel that personal connection in the way he portrays Jack's struggles.
So there's a rawness,
Yeah.
an authenticity to the character. That makes sense. But how does this tie back to the Overlook itself? Is it influencing Jack or just bringing out what was already there?
That's the question that keeps you hooked, right? Is the Overlook a malevolent entity that's actively corrupting Jack? Or is it simply acting as a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the darkness that already existed within him?
Ooh, good question. And what about Danny, the son? He's the one with the shining, right? What did you make of him?
Danny is truly heartbreaking. He's just a 5-year-old burdened with this terrifying gift he doesn't understand. He's seeing things that would traumatize most adults. And on top of that, he's carrying the weight of his parents' troubled relationship.
So he's not just a plot device, the creepy kid.
Yeah.
He's got his own emotional baggage.
Absolutely. King does a masterful job portraying the emotional toll that Danny's gift takes on him. He's a child forced to confront the horrors of the adult world, and the Overlook amplifies those anxieties tenfold.
And speaking of complex characters, let's talk about Wendy. I know there's been some criticism of King's female characters. What's your take?
That's a valid point. And honestly, Wendy might be considered the weakest link in terms of character development. She's loving, she's fiercely protective of Danny, but her options are limited by the social context of the time. It's the 1970s. She's trapped in this marriage, in this isolated situation, with very few ways out.
That's a fair assessment. So she's not necessarily weak,
Yeah.
but more product of her time.
Right. And I think that's something that modern readers might find frustrating. We've come a long way in terms of female representation in literature. But I think it's important to view Wendy's character through the lens of the era in which the book was written. She's still a vital part of the story, and her fear and desperation contribute to the overall feeling of dread.
It's easy to judge characters from the past by today's standards, but I see your point. So we've got these complex characters, this chilling atmosphere. But what about the Overlook Hotel itself? You mentioned it being a character in itself.
No, absolutely. King brings it to life in a terrifying way. It's this grand, decaying hotel with a history of violence and tragedy that permeates its very walls. You can almost feel the weight of its past, the secrets it holds. Think about the real-life Stanley Hotel that inspired King. Those places hold a palpable sense of history, of things unseen and unheard.
Sounds like the perfect setting for a horror novel.
Yeah.
You mentioned King being good at building tension.
Yeah.
What are some specific examples in The Shining that really stood out to you?
There's this one scene with Dick Halloran, the chef who also has The Shining, in a shed. It's seemingly mundane, but the way King describes the atmosphere, the subtle shift in Halloran's perception, it sends shivers down your spine.
And for me, it's always been the topiary animals. That image of them coming to life is just...
Right. It plays on that primal fear of the familiar becoming something monstrous. King takes something innocent and twists it into something menacing.
Okay, so we've got the isolated setting,
Yeah.
the complex characters,
Yeah.
the creeping dread. But how does The Shining compare to other horror novels you've read? What sets it apart?
The Shining gets under your skin in a different way than, say, a book like House of Leaves, which messed with my mind, played with the structure of storytelling itself. The Shining is more grounded, more character-driven. It taps into those primal fears of isolation, of being trapped with something malevolent.
So it's less about mind-bending concepts
Yeah.
and more about the psychological horror, the human element.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so effective. It's not just about ghosts and creepy happenings. It's about the darkness within ourselves, the potential for violence and corruption that exists in all of us. The Overlook just amplifies those things, brings them to the surface.
That's a pretty thought-provoking idea. So for someone on the fence about reading The Shining, someone who maybe only knows the movie,
Yeah.
what's your final verdict so far?
If you're a fan of horror, psychological thrillers, and stories that explore the dark side of human nature, then The Shining is a must-read. It's a slow burn, but the payoff is incredible. And honestly, I think it offers a deeper exploration of the story than the movie, even though I haven't seen it.
That's high praise. But we're not done yet. We'll be right back to dive even deeper into The Shining and unpack some of those juicy details
Yeah.
that make it such a chilling masterpiece. All right, we're back and ready to delve deeper into the heart of The Shining. Before the break, we were talking about Jack's struggles and the influence of the Overlook. Is there a connection there?
Well, what's fascinating is how King uses the Overlook to explore this idea of inherited darkness. We learn that Jack's father was also abusive and an
Oh,
alcoholic.
it's not just Jack's personal demons, but a cycle of violence, almost like a family curse being played out.
Exactly. And that connects to the history of the Overlook itself. It's absorbed all the negative energy, that pain and suffering from everyone who stayed there before. It's almost like the hotel is a living embodiment of that inherited darkness.
Wow, that adds a whole other layer to the story. It's not just about one man's descent into madness, but a legacy of darkness that's been building for generations.
And that makes you wonder, is the Overlook influencing Jack? Or simply amplifying what was already there? Is it truly evil? Or just a mirror reflecting the darkness within?
That's a chilling thought. It makes you question whether any of us could resist the pull of the Overlook, given the right circumstances.
Right, and that's what makes The Shining so unsettling. It forces us to confront the potential for darkness within ourselves.
But it's not just Jack who's impacted by this inherited darkness. Think about Danny and his Shining.
You're right. We learned that Dick Halloran, the chef, also has The Shining, and he mentions his grandmother having it too.
So is this ability something that can be passed down through generations?
It seems that way. It's like a genetic trait, a sensitivity to the supernatural.
Yeah.
But it's also clear that The Shining can be amplified, made more potent in certain environments, like the Overlook.
So it's like a predisposition that can be triggered by external factors. It makes me wonder, what if Danny hadn't gone to the Overlook? Would his Shining have developed in the same way?
That's a great question. It raises the possibility that maybe we all have some kind of Shining, some potential within us, but it takes certain circumstances to activate it. Trauma, isolation, Maybe even specific locations? Who knows?
That's both intriguing and terrifying. It makes you think about the power of places, the energy they hold.
And how those energies might interact with our own vulnerabilities.
You know, for a book written almost 50 years ago, it feels surprisingly relevant today. We're living in a time of heightened anxiety, social isolation, uncertainty about the future. These themes really resonate.
Absolutely. And think about our current fascination with true crime, haunted places, the darker aspects of human nature. We're drawn to these stories because they offer a glimpse into the abyss. The Shining taps into that primal fascination, showing us the monsters that can lurk within seemingly ordinary people and in places.
Now, you've mentioned King's writing style a few times. Were there any parts of the book that didn't work for you? Anything that dragged or felt unnecessary?
Honestly, the pacing is deliberate. It's like King is carefully constructing a house of horrors, brick by terrifying brick. The lengthy setup allows him to establish a deep sense of unease, letting the horror unfold organically. And when things finally do go sideways, you're completely invested, feeling every ounce of terror.
Okay, so the slow burn is part of the strategy. It's not just filler.
Right. And I think anyone who enjoys truly immersive horror, the kind that gets under your skin and stays with you, will appreciate King's approach.
Now, earlier you said that, Wendy, might be considered the weakest link in terms of character development. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, compared to the nuanced portrayals of Jack and Danny, Wendy does feel less developed. She often falls into the damsel in distress trope, relying on Jack for protection.
But isn't there something to be said for her resilience? Her fierce determination to protect Danny in the face of terrifying circumstances?
That's a fair point. And to be fair to King, this was written in the 1970s, a time when gender roles were much more rigid. But it's still a valid critique. I would have loved to see more agency from Wendy, more exploration of her inner life.
So it's not necessarily that she's a poorly written character, but that she could have been even more fleshed out, given more depth.
Exactly. And I think modern readers, with our evolved understanding of gender dynamics, might feel that lack even more acutely. But even with those limitations, Wendy's fear, her desperation, still contribute to the overall atmosphere of dread.
You've also mentioned not having seen the movie adaptation. But for those who have, how would you compare the book to Kubrick's film, based on what you know?
From what I understand, Kubrick took some liberties with the source material, which is common with adaptations. I've heard King himself wasn't a fan of the film. But I think there's something to be said for experiencing a story through the author's own words. The book allows for a deeper dive into the character psyches, a more nuanced exploration of the themes.
So it's like you're getting the unfiltered version, King's pure vision.
Exactly, and I think anyone who truly loves a story, especially a horror story, owes it to themselves to experience the original source material.
All right, so we've covered the characters, the setting, the themes, but what about the actual scares? You mentioned King being a master of building tension. Can you give some specific examples of how he does that in The Shining?
Think about the scene with the topiary animals. It's not just that they come to life, it's the subtle way King describes them, the way they seem to shift and watch the Torrances. That creates a sense of unease. It's like something innocent and beautiful has been twisted into something menacing.
I get that. It's like the uncanny valley, something familiar becoming just slightly off.
Yeah.
And that's where the real horror lies.
Exactly. And another great example is the scene with Dick Halloran in the shed. It's seemingly mundane, but the way King describes the atmosphere, the subtle changes in Halloran's perception, you can feel the presence of something sinister closing in. It's a masterclass in building tension and dread.
So it's not just about the big, shocking moments, but the slow, creeping dread that permeates the entire book.
Absolutely, and that's what makes The Shining so effective. It stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Okay, so we're back for the final act of our deep dive into The Shining. We've explored the characters, the setting, the scares. Now it's time for the big question. Is it worth your time?
Absolutely, especially if you enjoy a good psychological thriller with a touch of the supernatural. King's ability to create that creeping dread, the feeling that something is just off, is masterful.
Right, it's not just about ghosts jumping out and saying boo. It's about the darkness within, the potential for evil that lurks beneath the surface of everyday life.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes The Shining so enduring. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, the things we try to keep hidden.
You mentioned that the Overlook Hotel itself is almost like a character in the book.
Yeah.
For those of us who might be intrigued by real-life haunted places, is there a connection to explore there?
Well, if the Overlook piqued your interest, you should definitely look into the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. It was King's inspiration for The Shining, and it has its own share of spooky stories and reported paranormal activity. Some people even believe that King himself encountered a ghost there.
Wow. That's fascinating. It's like the line between fiction and reality blurs a bit.
It does, and I think that's part of what makes The Shining so effective. It takes those real-world fears, those places where our rational minds falter, and amplifies them into something truly terrifying.
And for anyone who might want to explore more of King's work after The Shining, what other books would you recommend?
Oh, there are so many. If you enjoyed the psychological depth of The Shining, Misery is a must-read. It's a terrifying look at obsession and the dark side of fandom. And for something a little different, but equally unsettling, check out Pet Sematary. It explores the themes of grief and loss in a truly haunting way, questioning how far we'd go to bring back those we've lost.
So many chilling tales to choose from. But before we let you go, is there anything that really stayed with you after finishing The Shining? A lingering question, a thought-provoking idea that King left us to ponder.
You know, throughout the book, the Overlook is portrayed as this malevolent force, almost an entity unto itself. But what if the real horror isn't supernatural at all? What if the Overlook is simply a reflection of ourselves, a manifestation of our own inner darkness?
Whoa, that sends shivers down my spine. It's like saying we all have an Overlook lurking within us, just waiting for the right moment to break free.
And maybe that's the most terrifying thought of all. The real monsters are the ones we create ourselves.
That's a powerful takeaway.
Right.
Maybe all work and no play doesn't just make Jack a dull boy. Maybe it awakens something much darker within us all.
Exactly, and I think that's the true brilliance of The Shining. It's a horror story that stays with you long after you finish reading it, forcing you to confront the darkness within yourself and the world around you.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into The Shining. Huge thanks to our expert for sharing her insightful analysis. We hope this deep dive has helped you decide whether to add The Shining to your reading list. And remember, if you do brave the Overlook, keep the lights on. And maybe a baseball bat handy, just in case. Until next time, happy reading.